The first emotion is disappointment. Touch somebody and say, disappointment. Most of us don't see disappointment as an emotion, but the reality is feeling disappointed is really emotional. And feeling disappointed is something that we're all going to experience at some point in time in our lives. Amen. And disappointment really refers to unmet expectations. That's what disappointment is. Disappointment is caused when you have the bar set right here and the person who you have expect to be right here, they get right here. And so you see, I expected you to be right here. I'm disappointed. And disappointment occurs when you have not only unmet expectations, but you have hopes that go unfulfilled. If you've ever had a desire for a job that you've applied for and you really was like, yeah, this job is for me, and then when they reveal who got the job, it wasn't you, you were disappointed. Because disappointment is not only when our expectations are not met, but it's also when our goals and aspirations and our hopes go unfulfilled. If you've ever been let down by someone, you have experienced what it means to be disappointed. And sometimes we may feel disappointed if we believe we should be further along in our lives than we are. That if you thought that, by this age, I should have had this type of car, or this type of house, or this type of family, or this type of job, or this type of finances, then sometimes when you're looking at your life and you realize or you feel as if you're not where you're supposed to be, then you're struggling with disappointment. That's an emotion. And disappointment is a very powerful emotion. And as long as we live in this world, we're going to struggle with disappointment. But disappointment can also have a spiritual root. For example, let's say you've been praying about something and you feel as if God has not answered your prayers. You might be struggling with disappointment. You might feel disappointed that God hasn't moved on the specific prayer that you have lifted up to God. Or you might feel that God didn't move soon enough, that I've been praying for 2 years and God just now starts to move, and you might be disappointed that God is not moving in the way in which you would love to see God move. And this is a very common concept, but we don't like to talk about it because we'll shame you for being honest sometimes. When the reality is some people feel disappointed that their prayers may appear to go unanswered. And I was reading in the scripture and I said, one person who really might have struggled with disappointment is Paul. The Apostle Paul, because Paul had this impediment. He had this physical ailment, this condition that the Bible refers to as a thorn in the flesh. And Paul prayed about this thing because in Paul's mind, this thing is getting in my way. I really would do some amazing things for God if I didn't have this thorn in my flesh. So Paul kept praying, and guess what? His prayers went unanswered for a while. And then the Bible says Paul pleaded with God 3 times, asking God to remove this thorn from his flesh. And God said, no, for my power is made perfect in weakness, because my grace is sufficient for this thing that you're struggling with. See, we got to understand that even if disappointment rises up in your heart, that you have to know that God's grace is sufficient to deal with being let down. That even if you experience disappointment, you got to look to God and ask God to bestow upon you greater grace so that disappointment doesn't distract you from doing what God has called you to do. You got to use the grace of God to overcome feeling disappointed. Because you're going to be disappointed. It's just the reality of life. Your expectations will not always get met. Am I talking to somebody? If you are in a relationship, you're going to get disappointed at some point along your journey. But that does not mean that God's grace is insufficient for that moment. You got to rely on God's grace to deal with disappointment. Paul learned this. Paul said, you know what? Your power is made perfect in my weakness. So I'll boast all the more in my weakness, because when I'm weak, I'm strong. See, you can never declare that you are strong when you're weak unless you're really relying on the grace of God. You can never utter out of your mouth, you know what, I'm okay with this not going the way I wanted to go. I'm okay with feeling disappointed for a moment, because I know God is going to bestow upon me greater grace. So this thing really doesn't hinder me. It won't stop me. It won't prevent me from doing what God has called me to do. So we can exercise dominion over disappointment through the grace of God. So what we really need, what we really should be praying for, is more grace. We shouldn't always ask God, God, do this thing the way I want it to be done, because as Paul had to learn, that listen, God may not answer your prayer, but God will send you more grace to deal with the thing that you're praying about, because maybe that thing you're praying about is actually not a hindrance. Maybe it's a hindrance to you, but it causes you to pray more to God. So God said, I'm going to let that thing stay there a little bit longer, because I love to hear you call on me. I love to see you pray. I love to see you consult me. So I'm just going to continue to extend you grace so that you might have that thing that you're disappointed about, but God says, I still use you for my glory.